I introduced the paradigm of using neural networks to model how our brains make our minds and the basic equations that people still use to this day for that purpose. I worked like a dog and made a steady stream of major discoveries from 57 to the present. And along the way, I published around 570 archival articles with over 100 PhD students, postdocs, and faculty. Our models have been used in large-scale applications to engineering, technology, and AI. We are sort of the main source of autonomous AI. Our vision models become signal processing models. Our recognition models become pattern recognition and prediction models.
Dr. Stephen Grossberg is the father of computational neuroscience and artificial neural networks, often called the Einstein of the mind. At just 17 years old, he wrote the first equations describing how brains make minds, launching a field that decades later would ignite the modern AI revolution. Though, as you'll soon hear, he's fiercely critical of today's large language models and of the tech leaders who built them. He also claims to be a victim of one of the largest plagiarism scandals in scientific history, alleging that several Nobel Prize winners built their fame on ideas first laid out in his early mathematics. Grossberg went on to create the groundbreaking adaptive resonance theory, a model that explains how the brain learns new things without forgetting the old, a blueprint for intelligence that's stable, real-time, and frankly still ahead of its time. His models are now used by DARPA, Boeing, and even perhaps the NSA. This is the untold story of the man who may be the real father of AI, a story of genius, resistance, and the hidden algorithms behind human and machine thought. Subscribe before your brain's adaptive weights reset and you catastrophically forget this channel.
Many people in AI knew about my work. They did not rediscover it. They plagiarized it. Hopfield did that a lot. This has happened multiple times in my life. Some of my biggest discoveries have been plagiarized. And so while I was working like a dog, they were building their reputations by marketing the discovery of mine that they stole. Hopfield, Cajon, and Rumelhart, they're very famous. They all stole something big, and they knew they were stealing it. The dishonest marketing of some AI practitioners, given what I've learned about people whose main goals are to get lots of money and power. OpenAI have continued what I consider the AI tradition of dishonest marketing.
Dr. Stephen Grossberg, it is a true honor and pleasure to have you on the podcast. You are often referred to as the father of computational neuroscience. You correctly changed my initial grandfather. You made a good point. The father produces a field, and you absolutely are the father of computational neuroscience. Can you explain in simple terms, what is computational neuroscience?
Well, first, let me mention why I've been called the father of computational neuroscience. And that's because in 1957, long before you were born, I was a 17-year-old college freshman at Dartmouth College taking introductory psychology. And my head exploded during the course. You can never explain why these things happen. And that year, I introduced the paradigm of using neural networks to model how our brains make our minds and the basic equations that people still use to this day for that purpose. And such biological neural networks constitute computational neuroscience, which is just the science of modeling how our brains work. So that's the sense in which I'm the father. 1957 was 68 years ago, and I was still a kid. Anyway, why I like to tell that story is, especially if young people are listening, you're never too young for, good things to happen and for you to try to seize those opportunities.
So what exactly is Grossbergian neuroscience, and how does it differ from other approaches?
Well, let me start with my strong belief that brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success. It just means that Darwinian selection is guided by how well our brains enable us to adapt to a changing world. And if we don't adapt, we die, whether individually or culturally. So I start every project by studying scores or hundreds of psychological experiments because it's on the level of behavior that behavioral success is determined and that brain designs are selected by evolution. But now, even knowing what experiments should be grouped together so you can try to think about them is a challenge. And to do that, you have to develop a deep experimental intuition into the meaning of the data. So I know what experiments may reflect shared underlying design principles and mechanisms before I know what those design principles and mechanisms are. It's one of the wonders of doing pioneering science that your intuition through feelings and imagery can sort of lead you to group data in that way, because no one tells you whether data that may look very, very different on the surface is actually probing the same underlying design. And if you want to ask me later why that is so hard in terms of the equations, modules, and architectures that constitute models of mind and brain, we could come back to that later. And moreover, the challenge is that lots of data are presented using static graphs of how one or more dependent variables change as a function of an independent variable. For example, how performance accuracy, this is psychological data, remember, changes with the number of learning trials. Well, I then try to think about how humans, individual humans, generate those graphs. A behaving human. In other words, how each behaving individual learns to adapt in real time to its environment by generating behavior that may or may not succeed. So learning to think in real time about what was going on in the individual's experience that led them to behave in this way, that's an art form. It's very hard to teach. And I would sit with my PhD students and postdocs, and we would try to understand new data. And I would, by example, give them, help in trying to think in real time. Once you can think in real time, you're off and running. So thinking about behaviors occurring in real time has always led me to discover underlying design principles to unify lots of data and small groups of mechanisms whose interactions generate the behaviors. And that itself is a bit mysterious. Theory is an art form because in order to do that, there's a speculative leap, like Einstein talked about speculative leaps to discover special and general relativity, because in this case, the behaviors are emergent or interactive properties of lots of brain mechanisms and regions interacting. And in order to bridge the gap between brain dynamics and observable behavior, that's why we need models, because only models are rigorous enough to try to show how the interacting mechanisms generate these behavioral properties as emergent properties. And that, again, is a bit of a mystery, because there's this emergence, there's a gap, and you have to fill it with the theory, but you don't yet have the theory. And so true theory is an art form, true discovery. And, like Niels Bohr was asked how he discovered, his great work in quantum mechanics, and he couldn't explain it. It's a speculative leap. Same with Einstein. So I can talk about brain mechanisms because I gradually realized that my real-time analysis of psychological data forced me into discovering brain mechanisms. And I didn't realize all that on my own. I was a freshman in college, and I had 3 medical student friends who were learning basic neuroscience, and they would tell me a little about what they were learning, and the components of what they were learning, neuronal cell bodies, axons, synaptic knobs, signals down axons, transmitters, postsynaptic clefts, all this I had derived from psychology, and that was thrilling, and I never looked back. So I was hereby led to discover a modeling method and a cycle whereby a lot of behavioral data led to the development of neural network models to show how brain mechanisms generate behavior as emergent properties. And in saying a cycle, that's because you're never done. Okay? The analysis showed at any stage of the cycle what the model could explain and predict. And it can't explain everything, but the boundary, I like to say, between the known and the unknown sort of directed your attention to facts that could not be explained yet. And you think about them long enough until you see they reflect another design principle. And then you go through the cycle again, incorporating the new facts that you can explain, but in the old model that expands in a self-consistent way. In other words, you've made a mistake if you have to throw away the old model.
Right.
And I've been lucky not to have to, and I think that's the power of being able to think in real time about underlying designs. And the cycle continues to this day. You're never done. We never fully understand human intelligence. But let me just summarize this by saying that brain anatomy and neurophysiology can, through models, be understood as natural designs for learning and behaving adaptive behaviors autonomously in real time. Autonomy is a key theme, and autonomy, which we are experiencing now, we shouldn't take for granted. In fact, most of AI, including ChatGPT and LLMs, there's no autonomy there.
That was all really well explained and super, super interesting.
2025 is the year that me and you are going to fix our sleep. Now, that does not mean that we need to go full Brian Johnson on it, but one thing we can do that's super easy is to buy the highest quality sleep mask on the market, and that is Manta. I've been blown away by how much better I sleep with one of these on. It's just a fact that people are not sleeping in completely dark environments, and studies show that affects sleep quality, time to get to sleep, and increases the fragmentation of your sleep. I have tried other sleep masks. I first bought one on Amazon last year for like €5, but the problem is they're just really poor quality. They don't really block out any of the light, and you can't adjust them to your planet-sized head. Manta is fully adjustable, so it literally will fit all of the strangest and weirdest size heads out there, like mine. The Manta mask is literally completely blackout. I have studio lights coming at me from here, and I can't tell the difference. It is absolutely pitch black. This is the perfect environment that you need for sleep. Manta honestly feels like you're being cuddled by a cloud. I actively enjoy and look forward to putting these on each night. I just realized how boring that makes my life sound. I sleep with Manta every single night, and I've seen direct improvements in the quality, duration, and how rested I feel when I wake up. My Whoop data seems to agree. Manta have a bunch of different sleep masks on their website. I have tried the normal sleep mask as well as the sound mask. I like to listen to audiobooks at night, so for that reason, the sound mask was actually really, really good. For some reason, my girlfriend doesn't want to listen to how reality is a perception at 11 o'clock when we're trying to sleep, so this was a really good solution for that. It's also incredibly comfortable. But as I said, I think for most people, like 90% of people, the normal, ordinary mask is going to fill their requirements. Super comfortable and completely adjustable. Literally is just a really high quality, well made product. It's the best on the market. Manta are giving my viewers 10% off their first sleep mask. They ship internationally and they also offer a 60-day free trial. That's 59 of the best nights of sleep you've ever had. I literally promise that. But if for any reason you aren't satisfied, you will get your money back, no questions asked. I really couldn't recommend more if you're looking to do something to improve your sleep. A sleep mask is the lowest hanging fruit. It's so simple and easy to apply, and I think it will benefit your life and overall health, and I could not recommend Manta more.
Now, I think you set the stage there really well to take us back to 1957. You began building equations, neural network equations, for a brain that didn't really have the technology in that era to be able to measure it directly and get those kind of recordings. So how do you even start such an ambitious project? Like, that kind of breaks my mind of that someone could do that. You were creating equations for the brain before you could really measure it in any meaningful way. It kind of makes the whole thing even more impressive.
Well, I think the moral of the story is a 17-year-old kid, by thinking in real time, was driven by looking at data about human verbal learning into the modern equations for cell activation or short-term memory traces, activity-dependent habituation or medium-term memory, and learning and memory or long-term memory. Invariants of those equations, and maybe a couple of others, like spectral timing and so on, which I also introduced with my colleagues, are at the foundations of really all biological neural networks. And as I say, it's a true speculative leap. Before I would have words, let alone equations, I would see the landscape and I would manipulate it in my mind by asking leading questions and having feelings about the direction in which I should be moving, until finally things became clear enough that I could introduce new words to describe what I meant. Like the word adaptive resonance, it didn't just flow off my lips. What it was, a resonance, who would have thought of a resonance, and why would I have thought of it? So in part, I sketched an answer to the question already, but in fact, using the method, and this is sort of, really the bottom line, a lot of my models predicted psychological and neurobiological data that had not yet been discovered. For example, in, I think maybe 1987 with Jean-Paul Banquet, we did a series of experiments, or he did in his lab at INSERM in Paris. What happens in oddball experiments, without going into exactly what they are, but, they lead to disconfirmed predictions. And there were event-related potentials, which are potentials you measure on your scalp. And we showed that these event-related potentials occurred temporally in sequences, like a P120, an N200, a P300. Also processing negativity, which I introduced before Natan and had data for that. But so it turned out that these operations, P120, N200, P300, had already been predicted in adaptive resonance theory. Okay. So that was an ERP, an event-related potential confirmation. Now, this elephant has many dimensions, and you could only build up increasing confidence that you're right. But as of this point, in many of the models, They provide a unification of our understanding of certain psychological, anatomical, neurophysiological, biophysical, and even biochemical data. And because you got such big chunks of the elephant, you start having confidence in it. But I think I'm going to talk a little about thought experiments in a little bit, and that's when you really know it's right.
So how did people respond to this? You were kind of operating between two fields, trying to merge mathematics and psychology experiments. So you didn't maybe have a home base. There wasn't a team of scientists that kind of knew how to adopt you. So what was the response to this when you started publishing these results, doing this maths and formalizing these equations?
Well, let me start by emphasizing that I'm a cup half full guy. I'm an incurable optimist. So I'll start by saying I was very lucky at multiple stages in my life that I even survived. I knew smart kids who didn't survive. And I just wrote a new book that takes the liberty of introducing autobiographical information about some examples of my luck. And I did that because of the topic of the book. And the book also emphasizes that I'm a believer in the law of unexpected consequences, especially when you're a pioneer. If you think you know exactly what's going to happen and you forget it, you're going to be surprised all the time. And some of those unexpected consequences will be very good and some not so good. So first, let me tell you why I give that autobiography. It goes way beyond what I can do today. The book's published by Oxford Press. It'll be coming out in a few months. It's called Your Creative Brain and AI.
Ah, fascinating.
And the subtitle is How We Learn and Consciously Experience Art, Music, and Meaning. And it's a sequel to my 2021 magnum opus, also published by Oxford, called Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind. Often at first, people thought it was crazy. And competitors said no one should look at my work because they didn't want to lose their audience. But then they gradually realized that I made important discoveries that they couldn't build upon by themselves because they didn't have the tools. So what do? Do you do what Voltaire did with Newton? You start publicizing it to the whole European continent? No. They try to plagiarize me without citation. This has happened multiple times in my life. Some of my biggest discoveries have been plagiarized. And so while I was working like a dog, they were building their reputations by marketing the discovery of mine that they stole. And I don't feel the need to name them, but if you insist, I will.
Name them. Name them.
Hopfield, Cajon, and Rumelhart. They're very famous.
Wow.
They all stole something big. And they knew they were stealing it.
I'm sorry to hear that. No one likes to hear that. That's just a horrible thing for someone to be pursuing.
That was the trade-off. I kept seeing new plateaus of discovery, and I was excited to learn more and more. I'm quite a spiritual person. I'm like an Einsteinian Jew. I believe in the harmony of the universe. I believe we're here only for a moment. And I wanted to come as close to God through science as I could in the brief time we're given in this world. So I wasn't going to sit around for years trying to protect my babies. You have to put your children out in the world. And unfortunately, the plagiarists in question usually spent their time marketing in the following way. There was no field of neural networks. I had to found that. And so they would promote my discovery in some group. There was a multidisciplinary set of communities and cliques that didn't interact at first. Remember, there was no Society for Neuroscience. There was no Society for Cognitive Neuroscience. There was no field of neural networks. You just had the people you could market to. But on the other hand, I worked like a dog and made a steady stream of major discoveries from 57 to the present. And along the way, I published around 570 archival articles with over 100 PhD students, postdocs, and faculty. That my model essentially all the main brain processes whereby our brains make our conscious minds in both healthy individuals and clinical patients. And the plagiarists usually spent their time marketing the model and trying to get priority for it while I was working like a dog on new discoveries. But, I also felt lonely because, when you're a pioneer, you're alone.
Yeah.
And, at first I was first in my class and brilliant. And then some people said, what happened to Grossberg? He used to be such a good student. So I felt I want young people not to have to go through this. So I started founding infrastructure. So young scientists could get trained in on new fields and not face the danger of rediscovering the wheel because their professor only taught them their discoveries and not what was known. And more established scientists, engineers, and technologists, so they could all report their results in a setting with other colleagues, and thereby everyone figure out what is the state of the art, as physicists have done for many years. So some of the infrastructure I founded the Department of Cognitive and Neural Systems at BU, where we taught undergraduates and graduates all about not only our models, but all the models that were available because they had to go out in the world and be literate. And I founded the journal Neural Networks, of which I was the founding editor-in-chief, so that there would be a place where people could publish in the field. When I try to get published, remember Bill Estes, who I admired greatly. He was really a founder, or perhaps the founder of modern mathematical psychology. And he was also editor-in-chief of Psychological Review, which was the main theory journal in psychology. And I tried to submit some of my papers to Bill, and it was sent back without review because Bill said, we don't publish that kind of thing here.
Right.
And I said, well, Bill, if you don't publish models of psychological data, then what is the leading theory journal in psychology, which is what Psychological Review is? Therefore, that took a little hubris, but I figured it was existential. And now I have more papers published in Psych Review maybe than anyone in the world. It opened the floodgates. I got the same thing from Vision Research. They sent it back without review. Well, we don't publish models of visual data. I said, well, why do you collect the data if you don't want to understand it? And now I have maybe as many or more papers than anyone in the world published in Vision Research. So there was a big fight to get published.
Yes.
I hope it's easier for. So, and then I also funded multiple interdisciplinary research centers, and they were funded by the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, DARPA, the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health, and I was director of those centers. And they included faculty from all over the Boston area. And you might ask, well, why would the Defense Department publish neural models of brain and behavior? Well, because our models have been used in large-scale applications to engineering technology and AI. We are sort of the main source of autonomous AI. And like our vision model becomes signal processing models. Our recognition models become pattern recognition and prediction models. So I'm the father of more than computational neuroscience. I'm the father of the field of neural networks in many senses. And I say that with a feeling of gratitude and pride,
As you should.
because I'm a shy kid. And how does a shy kid get up the chutzpah to do that? Well, somehow I managed. I was passionately committed to the field.
It's a beautiful story, and it really is such a staggering career. As I said, I've never had so much difficulty preparing for a podcast, because I would need like 100 hours with you just to cover like the basics of what you've covered. You really busted work, man.
At the end of our chat, you might reduce the number of hours, but I'm compressing a lot.
I'm sure. You talked a little bit about the process of doing that, but I'd love to hear more, as well as what advice you would give to young scientists with ideas that don't yet have a discipline, pioneering scientists in 2025.
Okay, so in part, as you rightly notice, my comments above are about that. And I don't think I could have succeeded hadn't I paid my dues, which is part of my advice. As I mentioned above, I worked like a dog to prove myself as a student by generally getting the highest grades in high school and college, and writing a highly original PhD thesis that proved mathematical theorems about how the neural networks that I discovered in college learn spatial patterns, very general spatial patterns of information. And these traditional successes of paying my dues is what motivated occasional faculty to try to do what they could to help me get accepted at the next school or job in my career, or to protect me from people who I made uncomfortable. So my first recommendation is you have to pay your dues. You don't, you might have a high or a low opinion of yourself. Some of my most successful students were not brilliant, but they were very committed to doing their work, and they went on to have often distinguished careers. The most brilliant students didn't always go on to have a fulfilling career. They just thought, it's coming to me. I'm due it. Whereas nothing is coming to us. So my main advice, though, to young modelers is try to find facts or problems that you're passionate about understanding. Because only if you have enough passion to know what is the answer, are you going to be motivated enough to put in the time needed to solve the problem. It took me sometimes 10 or 20 years while I'm working at a problem, shipping at it, realizing I have to solve this problem, that problem first, before I could publish a single paper about it. I don't expect everyone to be as crazy as I am, but and if there are no facts or problems that really interest you, I think you should just find a different profession than science that'll give you a sense of value and accomplishment if you're lucky enough to find one. And God knows we know the tragedy of most people who are working hard in the world is they may find no satisfaction in the work, but they may find satisfaction in being able to help provide for their family, which is traditional. And that's important, if you're lucky enough to have a good family. But for me, science wasn't a career choice. It was a spiritual calling. I mean, I felt a lifelong need to understand, this harmony in the world, how humans and animals in particular adapt to their world, a world that we know can be both wonderful and terrifying, because wherever there's light, there's also going to be darkness. We live in a yin-yang world, and you can't have only the good stuff, maybe for a short time, but eventually the darkness will set in. You just have to do your best to always look toward the light. So now you could ask me about the AI boom.
No, I resonate a lot with that passion. I think I love science, but I think what I discovered about myself is that I love the side of communication more than the side of being in a lab and pipetting liquids. I want to commit everything I have to elevating scientific communication as much as possible, applying the best animation, the best storytelling to try and take some of your ideas and translate them to a general population. And I'm just unbelievably passionate about that. The idea that I get to speak to people like you on a weekly basis is just incredible. Maybe not people exactly like you, but people that have done quite a lot of great science, and that's the joy of my life.
You talk about a lab. I would find it, I think, impossible to want to be a physicist who might be one of 200 co-authors on a paper.
Right.
Like for an experiment at CERN. For the people who are in charge of designing the experiment or creating the equipment or whatever, that's probably very satisfying. But if you're one of the cogs in the graduate student postdoc wheel,
yes,
I couldn't do that. But if you get satisfaction from it, that's great. And I hope everyone who does it is thrilled to be part of a team.
Yeah.
That's just not for me. That's just not for me.
This is one that I've been super interested in asking you, as someone who has really laid the bricks, maybe, of the boom in AI that we've seen in the last 5 to 6 years, this absolute exponential curve where suddenly everyone knows what AI is and knows what an LLM is and knows ChatGPT. And what I wanted to ask you is just, what has surprised you the most about the last 5 or 6 years? Given all of your background in the mathematics of neural networks, all of the foundations that you really did lay by yourself with your team, what surprised you the most?
I can't say I'm surprised.
Interesting.
By the dishonest marketing of some AI practitioners, given what I've learned about people whose main goals are to get lots of money and power. This is especially tempting to people if you can't understand or contribute to the excitatory and revolutionary cutting edge of discoveries in your field. So that's when you turn to marketing and stuff like that.
Did you envision a system like ChatGPT ever emerging, or autonomous AI? Was this in the roadmap 50, 60 years ago? Did you somehow envision this?
Well, when I started prehistory, symbolic AI was being developed by people like Marvin Minsky, also at MIT. In fact, Marvin really tried to make political difficulties for me when I was an assistant professor in the same department he was at MIT. And I think the reason is that Marvin started his career by trying to introduce neural networks, but he failed. And since Marvin thought he was the smartest man in the world, he couldn't tolerate that this young scientist, this kid in the math department, was successfully developing neural networks. So we tried to have him squashed. Anyway, there's an interesting story with Marvin that I won't get to probably, but their symbolic AI models proved to be brittle, and they hit a brick wall because, among other reasons, they couldn't understand how people learn and really understand the world. They couldn't go the distance. So companies like OpenAI have continued what I consider the AI tradition of dishonest marketing. In this regard, there's not one AI. Remember, AI before was symbolic AI. The AI I did was always biological neural networks and artificial neural networks that could be implemented in large-scale applications in engineering, technology, and AI, and that's been going on for decades. But the AI that came out of symbolic AI is the AI of OpenAI and ChatGPT. And mentioning the words ChatGPT and autonomous AI in the same breath is sort of like a contradiction in terms, because ChatGPT can never, in principle, create a foundation for autonomous AI. And why do I say that with such conviction? If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but then you have to show me why. And the problem is that they build on deep learning, which is just the backpropagation algorithm as its learning engine. And I already wrote about 17 foundational problems of backprop in 1988 in a paper that's been cited thousands of times. None of them was corrected in deep learning. And because of that, just to mention a couple, deep learning is untrustworthy because its explanations are not explainable. In other words, if God forbid you use deep learning to make a financial prediction or a health prediction, and let's say you go bankrupt or your mother dies because you've depended on that prediction of a treatment, and you go to the deep learning practitioner who told you, yeah, do this or do that, and say, well, why did you tell me to do that? I'm bankrupt and my mother's dead. Their answer would be, I don't know, because their prediction is not explainable. And then you sue them for everything they're worth. It's also unreliable in the sense, there's very slow learning. Its adaptive weights can just change a little bit on each learning trial. So even with super fast computer servers, it could take weeks or months to fully train it. Like, backprop came back in part because since it became unpopular already in the 80s, the internet has millions of pictures of cats. And you might have a whole room filled with interconnected, uber fast computer servers. And even with all this compute power, you might put in picture after picture of a cat. And through slow learning, it might take a few weeks or God knows how long before you can learn the whole thing. And then you put in a picture of cat and out comes cat. And you say, woo-wee, but you've used a zillion megawatts of electricity to learn to make that prediction. And during the slow learning, at any point in learning, part of the learned memory can suddenly crash. It can experience catastrophic forgetting. And then you have to start all over again. They never tell you that. So ChatGPT builds on deep learning. That's its learning engine. And it's called a large language model, or LLM, which really does violence to the usual definition of language. Because ChatGPT, as you know, ChatGPT, it just promiscuously heaps together language fragments that it steals from all corners of the internet of the work of others. It could be phrases or paragraphs or articles or books, just heaped all together. And then you use an input query to try to find the closest match in that heap to make the highest probability prediction. But as many people have acknowledged, it does not know what it's talking about. There is no meaning. When I use language, I can, let's say I say, "Mommy threw the ball." Well, I can visualize Mommy throwing the ball. That requires you understand visual perception and our internal representations of conscious percepts. It also requires that you have feelings about Mommy that have helped you to recognize her face. How do you recognize Mommy from any viewpoint? That requires that you solve the invariant pattern recognition problem, which my colleagues and I have solved. But you not only have to solve the invariant pattern recognition problem, you also, when Mommy throws the ball, a particular view of her face is looking toward where she's throwing the ball. If you think about doing that in real time, you realize none of this is in ChatGPT. In contrast, my work does explain how humans learn language meanings. I only really started writing about that several years ago, and I'll now explain why. So let me tell you the titles of two of my papers. In 2023, I wrote a paper called How Children Learn to Understand Language Meanings, a neural model of adult-child multimodal interactions in real time. And then just this year, I published a paper called Neural Network Models of Autonomous Adaptive Intelligence and Artificial General Intelligence, how our brains learn large language meanings, how our brains do it, and their meanings. And I want to read you part of the abstract of my paper from this year to show why it took so long for me to publish papers with this title, because it built on a foundation of decades of discovery that I was able to synthesize in these papers. And this is what ChatGPT doesn't and can't do. So let me read you the first part of the...
Please.
So this article describes a biological neural network model that explains how humans learn to understand large language models and their meanings. This kind of learning typically occurs when a student learns from a teacher about events that they experience together. And multiple types of self-organizing brain processes are involved, including, and this is what I want to emphasize, what are necessary to even get off the ground. My papers just get off the ground. Content addressable memory, conscious visual perception, joint attention, object learning, categorization, and cognition, conscious recognition, cognitive working memory, cognitive planning, neural symbolic computing, emotion, cognitive emotional interactions and reinforcement learning, volition, and goal-oriented actions. And I give my model a name to compare and contrast with ChatGPT. I call it Chat Some, S-O-M-E, where some abbreviates self-organized meaning. And I would just wish that Google Mind, they spent millions investing in ChatGPT to bring it to market. Please do the same for Chatsum. They'll make trillions in the long run if they build on it properly. It'll take a lot of work. I've just opened the floodgates and given a foundation. Not the end, it's the beginning. So
something that always strikes me when I talk to neuroscientists is just how staggeringly complex the brain really is. It's this incredible prediction engine, always trying to make sense of the world and keep us safe. But it's important to remember we're still running ape hardware. Our brains weren't even remotely built for the chaos of modern life. And sometimes they just get scrambled. I've recently had some difficulty in my own personal life, and I realized that it was about time my own ape prediction system got the gym workout and just rebalancing that it's probably needed for quite a long time. So I booked my first therapy session with BetterHelp, who I'm incredibly excited to be partnering with on this video. A massive umbrella review of hundreds of randomized control trials found that nearly every meta-analysis of psychotherapy favored it over control conditions. In other words, mental health professionals from decades of research consistently find that talking therapies do actually work. BetterHelp is an entirely online therapy platform designed to make that process incredibly simple. You can connect with a licensed therapist from your home on your schedule through video, audio, or even text with literally no fuss at all. What I like about it is that you can switch therapists at any time until you find someone who you personally can build rapport with and open up to, which is such a critical part of therapy, at no extra cost. If you've ever thought about trying therapy, or you're just feeling a little bit stuck in your own head lately like I was, this might be a great first step that I really couldn't recommend more. Visit betterhelp.com/giantshoulder to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp/giantshoulder, and in doing so you also support the channel. Links are down below, because sometimes the most powerful way to understand your own brain is just to talk about it.
What is connectionism in your own words? And hopefully, again, mainly for my own sake, in as simple terms as possible.
Well, I hope I've kept it clear. So far, I am trying. Like so many general terms, which are chapter headings or book titles, it depends who you ask. So in brief, connectionism just says that there are connections in a network. Connection. However, backpropagation, for example, has only feed-forward connections in one direction. And adaptive weights at the end of the connections that can learn through experience. These are adaptive weights are also called long-term memory traces. However, it has no short-term memory traces or cell activations. Remember, I discovered those as a 17-year-old. And those short-term memory traces are necessary to give you an internal representation of a current experience. Okay? In other words, there'll be an activation pattern in short-term memory that is, this set of critical features to which you're paying attention in the world, whether visual or auditory or affective or what have you. That doesn't exist in backprop or deep learning. And because it has no feedback connections, it can't learn expectations about what's about to happen. But it can't pay attention to the salient critical features that are the ones that are predicted and therefore should go into your adaptive weights. So what you're learning are what it takes, whether bottom-up adaptive filters or top-down learned expectations, that those adaptive weights are learning what has led to successful prediction in the past. And when you read out the top-down expectations, they're going to be matched against your bottom-up feature patterns, and you're going to try to focus your attention on what you expect to happen based on past experience. So here we get the adaptive resonance theory, because art, which I first derived in 1975 and 76, adaptive resonance theory or art has both bottom-up adaptive filters, which help you to learn recognition categories. And the recognition categories can read out, learn top-down expectations, and then when there's a good enough match between a currently active bottom-up feature pattern and a currently active top-down expectation, the network can go into an excitatory feedback loop, which can amplify and synchronize and prolong your paying attention to those combination of features. And that sustained state of amplification and synchronization and prolongation is what I call a resonance between excitatory pathways, bottom up and top down, matching feature pattern with a category. And so resonance is like a way of saying, these are the good data. And that's why resonance triggers learning. And that's why I call it adaptive resonance theory. But also, not only does the top-down expectation lead to a resonance to trigger learning, but it also protects you against catastrophic forgetting, or does not experience catastrophic forgetting. And both deep learning and backprop do, because they're feed-forward networks that can't protect you against catastrophic forgetting. So art solves what I call the stability-plasticity dilemma. How you can have fast learning without forcing fast forgetting, which is a paradox. How can you learn fast and then remember for a long time? That's what art solves. You could have plasticity without catastrophic forgetting.
Could you explain that term, just catastrophic forgetting, quickly?
Well, catastrophic forgetting means, like I was talking before about deep learning, it's very slow learning, and your adaptive weights change just a little bit on each trial. And then on a totally unpredictable trial, an unpredictable chunk of what you learn crashes. The weights just aren't protected. They can go to zero. It's gone. And then you have to start everything all over again. Art, in particular, like Gail Carpenter proved in 1987 in our Art 1 paper already, how art using fast learning could learn a whole database on one learning trial.
Wow.
With learning and without catastrophic forgetting. That's a theorem. It's a series of theorems. Our 87 paper, if you look at my webpage, you can read it on my webpage.
I'll leave all the links for all these papers that you mentioned down below.
Well, that paper's been cited over 4,000 times. And I realize there are papers on deep learning and backprop that have cited more, partly because they've been marketed so, and partly because people don't try to actually understand how they work. And then if they don't work, they get pissed off. But in art, that paper proves mathematical theorems that guarantee exactly how it works. Without simulations, you don't need simulations. And art also proves that after you learn a new category and you put in well enough matched input pattern, it goes to the globally best matched category in a single feed forward feed. You don't have to search. You'd get a globally best match in the bottom-up filter. So it solves the global minimum problem, which backprop and deep learning also have. So
Could you explain that just a little bit more? I'm not sure I understood the global minimum problem and reaching. Could you just explain that a little?
What it means is, given a pattern, it's activating the bottom-up adaptive filter. The adaptive filter has one-to-many connections. One feature can send signals to lots of different category nodes. As a result, each category node is getting inputs from a lot of features. And then all the category nodes compete. And if you have the simplest network, it's called winner take all. The category that got the slightly biggest input on the first trial wins. And then after learning, it will efficiently win in response to not only that pattern, but patterns that are sufficiently similar to it. So to say the statement that you go to the globally best matching category, it means that when you put in the input pattern and this bottom-up activation occurs, the category that's chosen without search, just on the first sweep in competition, best represents the input pattern among all the categories you've learned over your whole lifetime.
Right.
And false in things like backprop and deep learning. They talk about an energy landscape, and there are local minima, and then there's the global minimum, and that's where you want to be, but you often get trapped in the local minimum, which isn't the best answer.
Right.
And then you have, theory after theory about how do you get out of there. Or it's proved you never get in there.
What is the best way to understand how information is stored in the connections between neurons in the brain?
Okay, so information is stored in the adapted weights or long-term memory traces at the end of the pathways or axons where signals go between cells. And the reason is because you'll have a cell and a connection or axon, a synaptic knob, a postsynaptic cell. And at the synaptic knob, where the adaptive weight or long-term memory trace is computed, you have a signal from the presynaptic cell contiguous to the activity of the postsynaptic cell. So you associate the presynaptic activity with the postsynaptic activity. And that's why the adaptive weight is where it is, because it's in a place where it has local information about the presynaptic cell that sent the signal right to it and the postsynaptic cell that abuts it with its activity. Okay. Does that help?
I think so.
That's all there is. All the information that's stored in long-term memory is in adaptive weights. But short-term memory temporarily stores all the representations of a current experience. And then as the experience unfolds, the patterns in short-term memory are changing, guided by previously learned long-term memory traces, which are also, when you go into resonance, being updated in response to the changing short term. So there's a cycle between short and long term. So you have to be careful by what you mean by information is stored in the connections. That's only long-term memory. You could also have medium-term memory, but that's not long-term. That's just, fatigue.
Differentiate that a little bit more between medium and long-term memory.
Okay, well, in a synapse, let's say the synapse, the signal going to the synapse, and in a lot of synapses, one of the things you do is you release a chemical transmitter, goes across the synaptic cleft, and that activates the postsynaptic cell or inhibits the postsynaptic cell, depending on if it's an excitatory or inhibitory transmitter. But that transmitter needs to be produced because you're using it up when you release it into the synaptic cleft. If you don't keep replenishing the transmitter, then the synapse gets tired. Even if your adaptive weight hasn't changed, you don't have enough transmitter to express it as vigorously as it did when your transmitter had accumulated enough. And Gail Carpenter and I, for example, in the 80s, I think, we had an article about vertebrate photoreceptors, among others, where we try to explain how, in response to photons, the vertebrate photoreceptor doesn't get tired too fast. Because otherwise, you'd see something and then the world would go dark.
Right.
And then you'd see something and the world would go dark. So there are active, and actually my first paper where I did this, and then the paper with Gail refined it, was in 1969, if you can believe it, shortly after my first paper in 1967. And it's called The Production of Chemical Transmitters and Related Topics in Cellular Control. The reason I wrote that is I was concerned about this issue. Why doesn't it get tired? And at that time, there were great neurophysiologists. I haven't said their names for so long, like Bernard Katz, others. There was a bit of data about transmitter production, mobilization, release, and I modeled it in 69, not to say it was the end all. No one else was modeling, and the data were fragmentary. I haven't come back to it except several times I have, but I don't want to go through why and when. But, the synapse is a complicated organ in its own right, the synaptic knob. And then there are trophic feedback from the postsynaptic cell to the synaptic knob, and there's a kind of resonance between the synaptic knob and the postsynaptic cell. It's very complicated. It's very beautiful. But if you glance at some of the diagrams in my 69 paper, which is on my webpage, you'll see that even then I had great respect to these details.
Yes.
Because part of the issue is to look at the whole elephant from micro to macro.
It seems like much of the AI world, the modern AI world, has rediscovered concepts that you pioneered oftentimes decades earlier. How do you view the relationship between connectionism in neuroscience and connectionism in AI today?
Well, let me make comments in response to each part of that question. So many people in AI knew about my work. They did not rediscover it. They plagiarized it. And then they marketed it over and over to get themselves cited. And as I was indicating before, they could get away with it because the fields of neural networks, computational neuroscience, and biologically inspired AI were so interdisciplinary that they could market my discovery to their particular community or clique, whose members, especially the young members, may not have known my work. Our field did that a lot. But in the final analysis, like today, there's no excuse for this because we live in the world of Google.
Yeah.
And anyone who Googles Stephen Grossberg will see I have almost 90,000 citations and an H index of 136. You know, if 90,000 people have cited my complicated work, there's no excuse for not knowing about it.
Yeah.
I'm much more cited than a lot of people who've won prizes that I maybe should have won. And now in computational neuroscience, sadly, there's a small clique there whose names I can mention, but I won't. They've gotten control of the awards in the field, and they give them to their friends in the clique or to people who are friends of members of the clique. This has happened multiple times. Quite a few of my famous colleagues have tried to get me awards like that. And the people who have won, their work is, how would you say? Let's just say it's derivative to mine and has been cited much less, and they're much less well known. So you figure. I have, on the other hand, I want to make this clear, won some lovely awards over the years from multiple societies. And I have them listed, or they are listed, I should say, on my Wikipedia page. So I have no lack of awards, just some of the bigger awards I should have gotten. I'll never get. For example, when I came up for tenure at MIT, even then, a number of the letter writers said I deserved a Nobel Prize. I will never get a Nobel Prize. And so I want to be clear. I feel like a very lucky guy. I've loved doing my work over the years with over 100 really wonderful PhD students, postdocs, and faculty. I've done it for 68 years, and I'm still publishing. How lucky is that?
Phenomenal. It's phenomenal. Really impressive.
No award can compare with the ecstasy, the true ecstasy. In some ways, it's better than sex. And I say that as a very passionate person, of being the first person to understand something that they've always wanted to know. And the answers are beautiful. They're elegant, they're harmonious, they're better than you ever dreamed. Like I had done models of vision with a number of gifted students and postdocs. And then, in a way, through serendipity, we realized how to incorporate our non-laminar models into models of lamina neocortex. You may know that perceptual and cognitive neocortex has 6 characteristic layers and various sublamina, and the same canonical cortical circuit can be specialized to represent vision, audition, recognition, cognition. And in fact, I and my students have shown, we've modeled using variations of this canonical circuit, all of these things. And by modeled, I mean our lamina model explains and simulates more data than any model. And explained and simulated more data than we could with the non-laminar model. So it's not just there to be pretty, it's powerful. And so right now, IBM or some other company, if it tried to make a nano chip of this canonical laminar circuit and put together these chips that do different things like vision, audition, cognition, recognition, you can do it because they all have the same format. The input and output lines are self-consistent. You could begin to think of building an autonomous, adaptive mobile robot with more and more intelligence built into it. You just add on more chips. And I also want to say that I feel lucky because I have so many wonderful friends and colleagues in science in many countries. And I've been invited hundreds of times to lecture all over the world. And I had wonderful hosts, and I met lovely, smart students. There's nothing like smart students coming up with their faces shining to ask for a question after a lecture. Finally, and last but not least, I have a wonderful family who I love a lot. But what could be better than that?
It was really nice, though. Really, really, really nice. You mentioned the stability plasticity dilemma that art solves. I want to go into that more. Why is that such a fundamental problem for both brains and AI?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned above, plasticity refers to learning and stability refers to the fact that learned memories are not overwritten by new learning. And that's a main reason for catastrophic forgetting. And in our 87 paper, Gail Carpenter and I showed how art can learn some databases that cause other models trouble in just a couple of repetitions. These are models that have superset, subset and supersets to be learned of some pattern of features. And we show that if you take out the top-down expectations, you get catastrophic forgetting, even in a small database of 5 inputs. A, B, C, A, D, I think. Maybe it's something like that. So art solves the problem by using matching of the learned top-down expectations that are read out by an active recognition category with a bottom-up feature pattern until a good enough match occurs. You search until a good enough match occurs. Then the system goes into resonance between the feature pattern and this category, and you learn any new information in the feature pattern into the critical features that define both learning and prediction in art. And you suppress the irrelevant outliers. You have nothing like that in deep learning or backprop. They take the good with the bad. They can't tell the difference between predictive features and outliers, the junk. And that's one of the problems you have when you don't have a matching with a top-down expectation.
Right. The way that they've got around that, get around it in inverted commas, is these massive reinforcement learning data sets, right? Being able to say, this is junk, this is not junk, this is child porn, this is not child porn. You know, all the really shitty edge cases, that's what they've tried to say is their innovation in the last couple of years, is just huge reinforcement, human feedback data sets, right?
Well, you know, backprop was always supervised. So what you're saying isn't clearly saying why you'd call that reinforcement learning. Recognition learning is not the same as reinforcement learning. And it uses different parts of the brain. For example, recognition learning may use the temporal and prefrontal cortices, and reinforcement learning may greatly involve midbrain reinforcement centers like the amygdala, hypothalamus, and even the basal ganglia. So they're very different. I don't like, therefore, the way one uses the word reinforcement learning, like Sutton and Bartow has gotten a huge amount of citation, and rightly so, because they use it in a particular set of applications where it's useful. But it has very little resemblance to how our brains do it. And one of the problems is that both art and the cognitive emotional model that I developed with many colleagues are general purpose in that domain. And the other reinforcement learning models are brittle and not general purpose at all. So they all hit a brick wall. I feel life is too short to hit a brick wall.
Yes, I agree. You've used the word resonance a few times. Obviously, it's crucial here to adaptive resonance theory. Can you explain resonance in intuitive terms?
Well, in particular, how expectation and surprise drive learning. So I'll give you two examples. If you go to the refrigerator expecting leftover turkey from Thanksgiving dinner, but there's no turkey, then we as humans will be surprised by the disconfirmation of our learned expectation. A positive appetitive drive motivates us to go to the refrigerator in the first place. We're hungry. And its disconfirmation occurs through what I call an antagonistic rebound that suppresses the positive motivation to go to the fridge and triggers a feeling of frustration. Where the hell is the turkey? And the positive and negative motivations then compete. And I explain how that competition removes the motivation to seek turkey in the refrigerator again, because if it didn't happen, you would persist. You would perseverate. Where the hell is the turkey? Where the hell is the turkey? And starve to death. I also see the example of coconuts in an oasis. Why don't you keep going back to an oasis that used to have coconuts and until there are no more coconuts, you keep coming back, you starve. So the surprise in art that drives search is how we can then shift our attention to learn a new category that better represents the unexpected situation. So we don't persistently go to the refrigerator till we starve. Instead, we're freed to explore other alternatives, like go to the market to buy more food or whatever, go to the restaurant. So there is a competition between your sort of intended plans and exploration, between match and mismatch, match and mismatch, match and mismatch. So I also like to talk about another thought experiment, which is important to show the role of art. I call it the turkey love dilemma. And suppose you just had a feed-forward associative net-like backdrop, and let's say it had two inputs, one that has a representation of the turkey and another that has a representation of your lover. So turkey activates this path, lover activates that path. And let's say you present turkey and you associate it with eating, and you present your lover and you associate it with sex. Big deal. Now imagine having a turkey dinner with your lover. You look at your lover, therefore activated, can't wait to get home for some sex. And then you look at the turkey to have your next bite of food, and you think of eating. So the question is, during this cycle, look at your lover, look at the turkey, why don't you get a cross association from being learned? So you want to have sex with turkeys,
Right.
eating your lover. This is serious because some people want to have sex with very inappropriate objects. It's fetishism. And art protects that through top-down learned expectations, because when you're in one channel, that top-down expectation dynamically buffers it. And then when you switch, you reset that channel, and it's dynamically buffered with its expectation. So you switch back and forth rather than have cross associations in a feed-forward map. So life can get both ridiculous and tragic very fast if you don't have resonance, up-down expectations, and matching.
Really well explained. I love the story, and I love your connection of the behavioral drives here. I'm really starting to see how the jigsaw puzzles are coming together in this quite complicated picture.
Now, let me just say the following thing. There are cognitive emotional resonances, just as there are cognitive perceptual resonances. They're both adaptive resonances. In fact, the first resonance I discovered was published in 1975 in a paper about reinforcement learning in the International Review of Neurobiology. And that discovery, when I was developing competitive learning and self-organizing maps, is when I realized that unless you have sparse inputs in a competitive learning situation, a bottom-up competitive filter, you're going to get catastrophic forgetting. But I already knew about top-down expectations from dynamically stabilizing reinforcement learning. And then when I put the top-down expectation, I had art. So reinforcement learning led me to art, and both in our brains, the cognitive emotional resonances and the cognitive perceptual resonances and so on, they both speak the same language, so that you can have feelings about what you know. And I discussed, the anatomy of this and how they resonate together. So when I see someone I like, I can consciously see them, know stuff about them, and have feelings about them in this global synchronization of multiple distinct types of resonances. Surface shroud resonance for conscious seeing, feature category resonance for conscious knowing, cognitive emotional resonance for conscious feeling. They're not all the same, but they share the same underlying dynamics, which is how they can all synchronize and give us the richness of a typical experience. Being able to say that gives me such happiness.
I'm thrilled.
But my mind, I see it in all of its glorious detail as I'm saying it.
I love that. The enthusiasm in your science clearly hasn't in any way diminished in 7 decades of doing great science.
Well, no, in fact, I met Gail Carpenter is the love of my life 50 some odd years ago. But before I met Gail, when I had girlfriends, which I had many of, when I looked better than I do now,
You look great.
well, for almost 86, I'm just glad to be here. I would say to them, I'm in love with my work. You can at best be my mistress. And
I'm sure that worked great. That was fantastic.
a lot of them settled. It was the world of free sex. And I worked out, so I looked really good. Anyway, now I'm a old, decaying heap of flesh. But
You've argued that all conscious states are resonance states. This might be one of the biggest questions I've ever asked in a podcast, but maybe the biggest of this episode. How does resonance in a neural network translate into the feeling of conscious recognition?
I don't think about the feeling of conscious recognition. Feelings are supported by cognitive emotional resonances. Conscious recognition is, I believe, supported by a feature category resonance. During it, you consciously know about the object you're attending. To consciously also see it requires a surface shroud resonance. But the feeling that you have about anything is supported by a cognitive emotional resonance. So this is what we had just been discussing, that a feature category resonance takes the features that you're processing, learns recognition categories, closes the loop. But you could know when that's active, you know about it, you know. But knowing isn't the same thing as having qualia. You don't see what you know. You just know, I just know it. But then you have the surface shroud resonance, which I won't go into all the science. I could, but it's in my book. And I think I review it in my new book, too. You need it to understand visual art. But the surface shroud resonance supports conscious seeing and being able to act on what you're focusing your attention on visually. So there's an interface in posterior parietal cortex where posterior parietal cortex can be resonating with different parts of visual cortex that supports seeing surfaces, but it also converts spatial attention into the intention to act. So while you're looking at it, you can approach it, you can reach for it, and so on and so forth. So there are three different resonances. So in my work, I've so far been led to 6 resonances. I don't think that's all of them, but it's most of them. Yeah.
We'll go into those differences later, maybe. Art has been applied in medicine, in fields of robotics, and as you've mentioned already, even national security. Or have there been any real world applications of art that have impressed you the most, surprised you the most? Did you predict that they would arise?
Well, first, you did mention national security. So there I like the following anecdote, and then I'll get back to the more complete answer. Many years ago, I just finished giving an invited lecture, and some people came up to ask me questions, and the last person in line came up and quietly said to me, "I'm from NSA, the National Security Agency," and he said, "Art is protecting the nation," and then he left. So presumably it's been used in national security applications for a while. But as with all important intellectual property, like if a company, and there are many companies who've used art, if there's a company that has valuable intellectual property, they're not going to tell you about it. They're not going to tell, this is the secret sauce I used to make this application. They're just going to try to sell their application. So, whereas people like Jeff Hinton, like bragging about, deep learning and this and that, these companies aren't going to say a thing. Anyway, so for the fuller answer, I derived art in an off-cited 1980 article published in Psychological Review. Psych Review was then and still is the leading theory journal in psychology. And I derived art from a few simple environmental facts acting together as evolutionary pressures on the development of our brains. So I don't go through evolution, but I use very simple facts we all know. And the thought experiment is about how any system that can autonomously, on its own, learn to categorize and correct prediction errors, how to design such a system. The thought experiment starts with the hypotheses and derives the basic properties of art. Moreover, the hypotheses never mention mind and brain. They're just facts about the environment. So art is a universal solution of the problem of autonomous learning, recognition, and prediction in a changing world filled with unexpected events. And so I guess that the art application that most delighted me is what it was used in a ad system by the Boeing company to help design airplanes. It was an airplane part inventory and was, I was told, used to help design the Boeing 777. And at the time, it was the largest application of neural networks to ever be implemented. It learned to classify, well, how do you describe airplane parts? 18 million 1 million dimensional vectors were in the Boeing airplane part inventory.
Wow.
And art could learn it in one learning trial. So that's why they used it. It's not, they didn't do us a favor. They didn't know about us. They searched all sorts of other algorithms until they found one that did the work. And that's, Gail and I showed that fast learning could learn very complex databases in one learning trial, maybe not always one. In fact, we also showed with this superset subset distinction, you might need more than one trial. That fact, plus the fact that art has a stable memory, it doesn't experience catastrophic forgetting, is one reason why it's used in a lot of applications. And let me go on. You asked me another question about the future of AI as we confront the problems of deep learning. And I'll just continue my comment. We have a CNS, that's Cognitive Neural Systems, the name of our department. The CNS Tech Lab webpage has lists of applications of art and our other neural networks to lots of large-scale applications in engineering technology and AI. So it's been fielded a lot. Those are the ones we know, not the intellectual property ones or the NSA ones. But that webpage, Gail and her colleagues, our students, put together in 2010 because we had a special grant that enabled that to happen. It's hard to do that kind of work in a university because the PhD students and postdocs want to write their thesis and get the hell out into the world.
Right.
So you need to have a special pot of money that's not just for research. And then you need to be able to, get the help from the students by, instead of, let's say, having them be a teaching fellow for part-time, they might help with the database. Anyway, since that time, Donald Wunsch, he has an endowed chair at the Missouri University of Science and Technology, MST. Don has developed quite a few applications of art for engineering and also has published a paper that lists many applications of art. He did that. It was very kind of him. I met Don when he was a student. He came to BU to visit us, and he spent many years developing art applications. And so he wanted to do that, to bring them all together as a paper that was published in the journal Neural Networks that I founded in a special issue about my 80th birthday. So more than about 5 years ago.
After more than 60 years of research, which is, again, just a staggering number, over twice the amount of time I've been on this planet, where do you stand on the mind-body problem? Do you believe that neuroscience is closing in on explaining subjective experience?
Okay, so I already commented a little about mind-body problem at the beginning, but let me remark and then move on from there. Adaptive resonance theory explains how we attend, learn, and recognize conscious percepts, knowledge, and feelings. So how we consciously hear, see, feel, and know things about the world, and use conscious states to plan and act to realize valued goals. The main point is there's a link between the resonant states that support these different kinds of conscious awareness and action. Like if it's conscious seeing, we might reach. If it's conscious hearing, we might speak. If it's conscious feeling, we might approach a valued goal. It's a link between resonance and action. And that's my proposed solution of the mind-body problem. We don't have resonant consciousness just to platonically, and passively experience the world. We use it to be able to effectively plan and act in the world. Mind, body. So we're continually closing a cycle with the world and our conscious awareness, acting, getting the results of our action. And that's where, reinforcement comes in. If there are predictive disconfirmations, they can be cognitive or they could be emotional. Where's the food in the refrigerator? So that has a cognitive aspect, disconfirmation of a cognitive expectation, but it also has an affective aspect, the rebound from wanting food to feeling frustrated that it's not there. And these are happening together, but they're not the same.
Yes.
Right.
So I think that does a good job at explaining the why. Do you think resonance fully explains the feeling of consciousness, or is there still some mystery left? Does the field still need to figure some things out?
Well, cognitive emotional resonances, I mentioned, explains how we have conscious feelings and link them to their causes. But there remain the mystery of qualia. No equation can explain how qualia feel. No equation. I might have a wonderful theory of conscious vision where I can explain every experiment you could imagine, physiology, anatomy, perception, about seeing. But that's not the same thing as seeing the color red. Likewise, for conscious feeling, I could have a theory that has all the explanation of all the data. Not the same thing as feeling scared. So equations can only explain all the processes and the behaviors that occur, but it can't explain the qualia. That, and you ask me next, I'll mention, you say, no matter how well we can explain brain function, the hard problem of why there is something that feels like to be conscious remains. And that's what I'm really saying, that if you want an equation to have feelings, an equation to have color, show me that equation. And that's all that we have ultimately in science. All of Newtonian physics is a few equations. All of Einsteinian physics is a few equations. All of black holes is a few equations. And we use our qualia to guide our intelligence to discover those equations. But still, the equations are not the qualia. I don't see how we'll ever feel an equation. But that doesn't mean that we can't try to do and are doing for mind and brain what's been done for a lot of theoretical physics. And as in theoretical physics,
Looking ahead, what problems in neuroscience and AI still keep you up at night? What breakthroughs do you most want to see in your lifetime?
okay, so for the general statement, what I most want to see for the mind-brain scientific community is to create enough educational opportunities for all young people to learn both the best theories and the most important data about how our brains make our minds in healthy individuals and clinical patients. I don't want there to be two separate worlds in which experimentalists are sort of, they have wonderful intuition, but they don't have, many of them still don't use the power of theory to drive their experiments. Of course, developments like computational neuroscience are a step in the right direction, but if they function like a closed quick leak, it's sort of defeating the purpose. As to my own work, what keeps me up at night, I did mention two of my recent papers on learning language meanings, notably how our brains learn large language models with meaning. So I'm very into that. I generally don't discuss what I'm working on currently because I have no clue whether I'll succeed in understanding it. I can't make predictions about the future because I couldn't have predicted the present. And I've worked on some things for many, many years before being able to say anything about it. And at the moment, I don't have that many years. But I have a new topic that I'm quite interested, maybe even passionate about to understand. And let's say I can't publish a foundational paper before I die. Well, if I know I'm dying, I'll try to share my partial results with others as well as I can. But let me be a little more philosophical. I'm a strong believer in Mahayana Buddhism. Do you know what Mahayana is?
No, I'm not familiar, please.
Well, one of the classes I loved at Dartmouth, which we took in springtime, and I used to walk through the woods thinking about it, Buddhism. Hinayana Buddhism, you try to find your own path to nirvana. Mahayana Buddhism helps others to reach enlightenment with you. And I've always believed in that. That's why I founded a department and a journal and societies and research institutes, so that other people could share with me the joy of discovery. Einstein was not a Mahayana Buddhism. He was quite a solitary figure and still one of the greatest ever. And I also very much believe in a Jewish concept. It's called Sheheryanu, which expresses gratitude for each day. So if you have very long projects, that doesn't mean you're not grateful for each day. And let me read you an internet explanation of Sheheryanu. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has granted us life, sustained us, and enabled us to reach this occasion. So we've reached this occasion, sir. And that's the story, as my mom would have said.
Really well explained. Wow, what an adventure we've gone on. I think we're nearing on 2.5 hours, which is absolutely crazy. It's been
crazy.
It's been so much fun. It's been so much fun. Look, I have a couple extra questions, but honestly, we've been 2.5 hours here. I think it's been amazing.
Why don't you ask me? But pretty soon I really should get off before I lose my voice entirely.
Absolutely. I'm really curious about these different types of resonances. I think you said that you discovered 6. You've mentioned feature resonance, cognitive emotional resonance. Can you explain what differentiates the resonances? Like what really sets them apart? What makes them different?
Yeah. Well, they each support a different conscious function in different parts of our brains. So a surface shroud resonance, I predict, gets triggered. That's for conscious seeing. Gets triggered between pre-striate visual cortex V4 and the next cortical processing stage, posterior parietal cortex, or PPC. The posterior parietal cortex feeds back spatial attention to the surface representation in V4, and it shapes itself to focus attention on that object. That's how we can pick out objects in a scene and recognize them and think about them and see them. And once the resonance starts, I predict that, and there's a lot of data for all these things, but all of them could use lots more experimental work, because these would be hard experiments. That V4 sends top-down matching signals to V2, V1, even lateral geniculate, all the way down to the retina, to select all the data consistent with it. So you're resonating on the stuff that you're processing right now. And bottom up from PPC to prefrontal cortex, higher levels in the brain. And you might say, well, we also see objects outside the central focus of our attention. So I'm focusing attention on your face, but I see the background. So that has a function and an anatomical substrate which enables you to consciously see and act on what you're looking at. A cognitive emotional resonance may go between, temporal and prefrontal cortex on the cognitive side and areas like amygdala and hypothalamus on the feeling side. And when you're resonating, you have a feeling and you're also paying attention to the objects that are giving you that feeling, which means you're going to be linking it also to a surface shroud resonance and maybe a stream shroud resonance when you're listening. So but it has a different function, a different anatomical substrate.
Just understanding that the neural populations in different brain regions contribute to different types of resonances that give different conscious percepts explained because maybe where my intuition was wrong was that I thought that all resonances occurred in defined neocortical layers. And it was always
clear. The mechanism of resonance is shared, but where the resonance occurs is different and for different functional reasons.
That explains a lot.
So if there is that's how different parts of the brain can talk together because the mechanism of resonance is shared. So for example, it may be that when you go into a resonance with one part of the brain, there's a gamma oscillation. Well, other parts of the brain that resonate might synchronize with that gamma oscillation until you have this very widespread vroom, 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 vroom going on.
Yes. No, that answers it for me.
And you have to keep in mind, the world is moving. We haven't talked about how you get reset and updating of representations. We haven't talked about the fact of when something moves across my visual field, the activations over here, when you get to over here, you don't want them still to be active, those cells back there, because otherwise there'd be smearing of the percept like a comet's tail. That's called visual persistence. So I worked for some time with several gifted students on explaining the mechanisms of visual persistence, how we don't get smearing. And delightfully, we didn't have to do anything new because the brain mechanisms we'd already modeled automatically quantitatively simulate persistence data. But we didn't know it. That's happened to me many times. And at bottom, what do we have when we're done with such a brain theory like I'm talking about, which tries to explain so many things? A small number of equations, short-term memory, medium-term memory, long-term memory. You could add on several others that are variants, like spectrally timed learning and stuff like that. But they're basically three main equations. Then there are a somewhat larger number of microcircuits or modules. So a typical kind of microcircuit is a recurrent shunting on center of surround net or a non-recurrent feed-forward or feedback. A shunting network is just one that the cells obey the membrane equations of physiology. So a recurrent on center of surround net, cells near each other excite each other, cells further from each other compete. It's sort of asking the question, why is competition so ubiquitous in the brain? And specializations of a recurrent shunning onset or off around that can do lots of different things functionally.
Yes.
That's why they can talk together. So a relatively small number of modules, each of which can be specialized to do lots of stuff. So a few equations, a somewhat larger number of modules, and the equations in the modules are assembled in architectures, like an architecture for vision, an architecture for audition and speech, an architecture for cognition. I call it a modal, M-O-D-A-L, not M-O-D-E-L, a modal architecture for a different modality of intelligence. And ultimately, in my work anyway, that's all there is: equations, modules, and modal architectures. And it's very much like physics, theoretical physics. Let's take cosmology a la Newton, or chemistry, a small number of equations in any science, somewhat larger number of modules. That's like atoms or molecules. Modal architectures, that's like macroscopic objects. This is the same kind of story everywhere.
Yes.
So
I just ask one more question, I think, and then we'll wrap it up, because I think we've had an incredible conversation, but I think both of our brains might be melting a little bit. Do you think by applying the principles of art, you can create conscious artificial intelligence?
yes and no, because as I've written in my book even, if you put together all of the models, it's not just art, okay? What's the point of conscious recognition if you don't have something to see, hear, or feel? All of the models, if you take the corpus of all of the basic models and synthesize them into a first, there are huge problems in getting feedback networks, and everything that we do that's leading to intelligence includes feedback, if only to solve the catastrophic forgetting problem, or if only to solve the stability plasticity problem. So you can adapt in real time without overwriting what you previously learned. If you use modern day computers to simulate that, you can try to replace your differential equations by difference equations that you could integrate, in time steps. And we've done that. We've used every trick you could think of to speed up simulations. But ultimately, if you're going to want to have a real world competent general purpose intelligence, you want nanochips. Remember, I talked about these canonical. You want those canonical lamina neocortical chips to embody a vision chip, an audition chip, a cognition chip, a movement chip, a feeling chip, and connect them and get a silicon brain. There are enormous costs in doing that. For example, do you know who Carver Mead is and for Federico Fagin?
Yes, I know Federico Fagin. The first name is unfamiliar, though.
Well, Carver Mead invented modern VLSI. Anyway, Carver and Federico started a company called Synaptics, and they invited me to be on the board to help guide them. And, I got a close-up view of what it takes to make a chip, let alone a laminar neocortical chip. Now, one of the good things about the embodiment in these laminate chips that lots of chips don't do is that our brains are fault tolerant, and these chips would be fault tolerant if not everything is perfect, because they're self-adapting, self-correcting. But otherwise, you make one little mistake in a chip, you have to throw it away. The die wasn't perfect, you throw it away, So if you can develop these, they don't even have to be nano, they just have to be chips. And you put together maybe 10 or 15 of them, you could have a brain. And that could be real-time, general purpose, autonomous adaptive intelligence. And, if you want to make it more intelligent, you add missing chips. So you can have that kind of machine intelligence. But just as, and you better be careful, as many people have shown in the movie I, Robot and many others, better be very careful that you build in a value system that cannot be overwritten as to solve the stability plasticity dilemma. But still, that intelligence won't have qualia, won't be able to explain qualia, and whether or not it has qualia, that's a mystery, because I don't understand, even with everything I know about perception and learning and all these other things, I don't understand why when I open my eyes, I see something. I can write equations for seeing, but I don't know if there's something special about cells that helps me have qualia. And I do know that I can't write equations for it. So does that mean I can't build it in silicon? I haven't a clue. Not a clue. But if that robot or whatever it is doesn't have qualia, it's even scarier.
Right.
I mean, you can never empathize with such a creation. A gazillion times worse than Frankenstein. Anyway, this has been a lot of fun. If you want to talk again, I'm game.
There's a substantial fraction of people, about 20%, who don't know what you're talking about. When you say you have inner speech, a voice in your head, they think you're ill and should probably see a specialist.
Yeah.
We started doing this work on asking whether you use your language regions when you think. And we found a very clear answer that no, you don't, even for tasks that sometimes feel like, somewhat.
I didn't know that. You don't use your language centers don't fire when you're thinking, even if you're definitely thinking in words?
See, you don't think in words. You think you're thinking in words.